So today we're going to begin talking about employment, unemployment, the set of topics that economists call the labor market. Although I'm always a little uncomfortable with that term because I don't think we should assume that the kinds of social processes that we're talking about here are or closely resemble what we think of as a market. But in any case, labor market is the term that's often used for uh, the outcomes around employment, unemployment, and wages. So today I want to talk just mainly about definitions and measurement, and then in a subsequent lecture we can talk about what we think about the sort of causal links between employment outcomes and other macroeconomic variables. So when we talk about employment, it's something we sort of take for granted as a category, but we're actually talking about a sort of complex relationship, a complex social phenomenon that really links together a lot of things that are conceptually distinct. So we think employment is work, and as work, it involves some sort of useful activity aimed at transforming the world. It is part of our collective activity of production, of transforming the world to make it more suitable for us, and of reproduction, of maintaining our existence as social and biological beings. And there's obviously an enormous amount of activity we have to carry out to these ends, some of which gets classified as employment and some of which doesn't. But we think that employment ought to be at least a subset of work in the broader sense. Employment is also defined by a relationship of hierarchy. It's a relationship of subordination to a boss. Now, obviously, there is such a thing as self-employment, where you are your own boss. It's a relatively small part of modern economies. And in some ways, it tends to reproduce the features of work that involves a boss. But in any case, the typical, the dominant, the sort of defining social relationship of employment is a hierarchical one where one person gives orders and the other person follows them. And then the third feature of employment is that the person who follows orders receives a specific kind of income, a check that is labeled wages, some type of money labeled wages. And as we'll see, that's really, from a sort of operational standpoint, the defining feature of employment is that you get this characteristic form of payment. And then work employment also involves being a recognized member of a certain kind of community. You're a participant in a firm or some equivalent entity that is carrying out this production process. And from a social standpoint, this is a very important part of the employment relationship. And also, when we actually think about how production is organized, it's not simply a sort of hands-off market transaction where you buy this well-defined labor service in return for a one-time payment. There's an ongoing set of relationships between people that actually are what organize the production process. Now, of course, there's going to be many ambiguous cases that don't fit all of these characteristics, but they fit some of them. Big dispute right now, for instance, is can you change something from employment to non-employment simply by changing the label on that check? If you call that same payment, instead of calling it wages, if you call it payment to an independent contractor, does that mean this is no longer an employment relationship, even if you're still performing the same useful work, let's say of driving an Uber car? You're still subject to the authority of a boss, which is often what the legal disputes around this hinge on, and you're still an ongoing member of this sort of community. In other words, the typical Uber driver is somebody who drives an Uber for their primary employment and not somebody who just does it occasionally on the weekend, although those people exist too. So there's legal disputes about those sorts of questions, since we have a whole set of norms and institutions to regulate employment. So it matters if a particular relationship is employment or not. And then there's going to be disputes over things that fall near the edge. There's also going to be cases, that are where you certainly are subject to the authority of a boss, and you're getting a check labeled wages, and you're a participant in some sort of firm, but there's a big question of whether you're actually performing any useful work. A widespread phenomenon in our society, arguably so. David Graeber, a wonderful writer who sadly passed away this past year, best known for his book on debt, which I highly recommend. But his last book was this book on bullshit jobs, which is about this phenomenon of things that formally and socially look like work, but don't necessarily actually involve any kind of productive activity, any kind of useful labor. So a lot of ambiguous cases, but nonetheless, and certainly in an economic theory and policy context, we tend to proceed as if there is this well-defined category of employment. There is this well-defined thing called labor, which is being supplied in a certain quantity, which we can measure and conceptually link to other quantities. So as we do economics, we're sort of forced to proceed on this basis, or we certainly habitually do proceed on this basis that there is this well-defined thing of employment. But we should also always keep in the back of our heads that the definitions are not handed down from on high. It's not a physical category existing out in the world. There are things in the world called dogs, and there are things in the world called cats, and there's really no fuzzy gray area in between. But employment is not like that. Employment is a question of, given this social reality, where we're going to choose to draw the line around it. And sometimes, the choice is not obvious, and the choice matters. All right, so that said, we do have a category of employment. So then we also have a category of unemployment. The flip side of that, and in many economic contexts, the one we actually pay more attention to. Unemployment means more than simply not having a job, although it does require that. But it also means that you should be willing and able to work. You should want to work, but be unable to find work. In other words, unemployment is a sign, if we're thinking in terms of a labor market, of excess supply of labor. Now that's if we're talking about involuntary unemployment in the Keynesian sense, which means that somebody should be willing to take the sort of job that other people like them have, but there aren't any jobs. But of course, we can't observe this directly. In our model, we can say, well, here's the prevailing wage. Is somebody willing to work at that wage? But in reality, there are many wages for many different kinds of work. And so the fact that you can't find a job at the wage you expect to get could mean that there's a lack of demand in the labor market, or that your expectations for your labor are unrealistic. So we have a problem in deciding whether a particular case actually resembles what we think of as involuntary unemployment. And that brings us to the next question, which is the broader category of unemployment. The person who wants a job but cannot find a job can conceptually be divided into three groups. What we call frictional unemployment is the sort of normal transition involved in the employment transitions, meaning between jobs, but really often more importantly, entering the labor market from some other status. Typically involves a period of search, during which time you want a job, you don't have one. But we think this is a sort of normal part of how employment operates and ought to operate. People should not be obliged to take the very first job that comes along. It's actually fine if they take some time. So that's frictional unemployment. Again, we sort of think of this as like you leave one job and then it takes you a while to find another one, but obviously most people try to find another job before they leave their existing one. So the more relevant case here is, young people entering the labor market, people leaving the military or leaving prison or some other status, or returning to work after raising a child. Anyway, frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment means there's some kind of mismatch between the workers and the available jobs. People want to work, but and employers want workers, but the workers can't or won't do the jobs that the employers are offering, and the employers can't use the workers who are offering their labor. That's structural unemployment. And then demand deficiency unemployment. It used to be called more frequently cyclical unemployment, but that term has sort of gone out of fashion because it's not as obvious as it used to be that this is strictly a cyclical phenomenon. Demand deficiency unemployment, true Keynesian unemployment. People can't find work simply because there is not enough demand for final goods. There is not enough stuff being produced in the economy to require the labor of everybody who is willing to work. So a lot of the policy debates about unemployment come down to the question of whether in some particular case we think that an elevated level of unemployment is primarily structural or primarily demand deficiency. Because if you think it's primarily structural, you're going to ask, how can we achieve a better fit between the workers and the jobs? And then typically you go to things like, if you're a liberal, things like job retraining, education, job placement services. And if you are on the right side of the spectrum, you say, well, people aren't a good fit because they're demanding wages and conditions that are too costly relative to the amount that they can produce. And so we have to get rid of some, or people are being prevented from taking up certain jobs by regulations. And so we have to get rid of those restrictions. People can't work because the minimum wage is $15 an hour. They want to work, but they are only worth $12 an hour to a business. So they can't get a job unless you get rid of that minimum wage. That's the conservative argument for dealing with structural unemployment. Demand deficiency unemployment you deal with by spending more money in the economy in some way or another. So anytime unemployment rises, we see these debates again. And after the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis of a decade ago, there was a lot of, in retrospect, I think, kind of silly arguments for this being mainly a problem of structural unemployment, the high unemployment that persisted for some years after the official end of the recession. So people talked about a great recalculation, that people had been engaged in some kinds of work, like, let's say residential construction, and there wasn't as much demand for that. There was a demand for other stuff like, healthcare or fracking in the Permian Basin or whatever. But it takes time to figure out, how you get the workers to where the jobs are and how you figure out. So this great recalculation, it just takes time to, rematch up workers with the new available jobs. People talked about zero marginal product workers, the idea that actually there'd been lots of people employed before the recession who actually weren't doing anything, and the recession was kind of an excuse to get rid of them, and there was no reason that they should be hired again. Redistribution recession, this notion that the cost of employment went up because of various, the Obamacare and other factors. So you got these arguments that this was not really a problem of weak demand, but a problem that workers were not suitable for the jobs available. And there were just a couple nice examples of that. Casey Mulligan, very conservative University of Chicago economist, wrote this book called The Redistribution Recession, which he says he's blaming, labor market distortions, regulations, limits on labor markets, minimum wages, healthcare mandates, whatever. That's the real, or an even more ridiculous one that actually people managed to make with a straight face, which was that video games had gotten so much better that now lots of people, especially young men, were choosing to spend their days playing video games rather than engage in paid labor. So this is not really unemployment. It's simply people choosing leisure over work. Okay, so that's a debate that we may or may not see revive in the next couple of years. But if unemployment remains high for an extended period, then we will for sure. Okay, so why do we care about unemployment? Well, a lot of reasons, and the interesting thing about this is that the reason you care about unemployment is going to change the way you want to measure unemployment, because the unemployment that matters for one purpose does not necessarily matter as much for some other purpose. So obviously, in the first most direct case, unemployment causes, if most people, actually, it's not true. If most households in our society depend on labor income, wage income, most families depend on wage income. Most people, when you include, for instance, children and older retired people and other people, a lot of people get their primary income through, the family, but most households, most families depend primarily on wages for their income. So if fewer people are getting wages, a lot of people are losing income. There's an immediate hardship there, and also, of course, an impact on demand and anything else that is influenced by income. There are also broader social costs because, for better or worse, employment is the primary social relationship for most adults. It's the primary community that you are part of. It is where you spend your day. It is the people outside of your family that you interact with most frequently. It's the thing your mind is focused on during your waking hours. And in many cases, this is kind of a tragedy because most of the work that people do is not very interesting, or rewarding. But nonetheless, it is the case that your ties to the larger world come in very large part through the workplace. And so if you're cut off from the workplace, you're cut off from a lot of other things besides simply that check you were getting labeled wages. And so high unemployment can be very socially destructive. Certainly a lesson a lot of people took from the 1930s was that democratic political systems cannot survive with extended periods of high unemployment. It's too destructive, it's too corrosive. It really, people will adopt all sorts of desperate measures if it seems like you're going to have, extended periods of double-digit unemployment. So that's from a sort of broader social standpoint. As economists, we care about it for some other reasons. First of all, unemployment is tied to a lot of other things that go on in the economy. Income, for instance, GDP, output, all then, are directly tied to employment outcomes. And so if we want to sort of gauge the level of activity in the economy, unemployment is a good way to do that because the unemployment rate moves quite rapidly in response to sort of shifts in demand or other factors that might influence output, and it can be measured more quickly and reliably than output can be. So a lot of, for instance, people in business and finance pay attention to unemployment and related labor market outcomes because they're sort of the most real-time indicator we have of what's going on in terms of the overall level of economic activity. We're also interested in unemployment because it's a measure of unused potential. It's foregone. I wrote outcome. I meant output there. It's a measure of foregone output that stuff we could have produced, but aren't producing. So it's in a sense, how far short are we falling of what our economy is capable of producing? At least that's the way a lot of economists look at it. Unemployment is a measure of the difference between what we're actually doing with the sort of real supply side resources available, what we're actually doing with them, and what we could do with them. Now, on the more heterodox side, a lot of people would argue that, in fact, although certainly unemployment, as we measure it, reflects unused potential, there is a lot more potential that is probably going unused, even if we have, full employment. But certainly one measure of unused potential, and one reason people care about unemployment. Now, of course, obviously here we see there's a difference because, for instance, if you care about the loss of income, then you're not an unemployed person who's getting a generous unemployment benefit is you kind of solve that problem. But if you care about the lost output, then giving the person an unemployment check does not solve the problem. So if your focus is on the income piece, then you might say generous unemployment benefits are the solution. But if your focus is on the wasted potential, then you might think the problem is actually not solved, or maybe even exacerbated. And there's certainly a right-wing view that probably some of you or many of you have encountered, which is that it's so destructive for people not to have the structure and so on of the workplace that it's worth actually imposing real costs on them to force them into that workplace relationship. So now another way, and maybe the most important way we think about unemployment in a macroeconomics context, is as an indicator of labor market slack. In other words, how hard it is, relatively speaking, for employers to get new hires. And here, the critical difference, if we're interested in unused potential, if we're interested in income or broader social costs, then it doesn't really matter if the person who's not working actively is seeking work or not. If they theoretically could work and they're not, then they're losing the wage income they could get, and we're losing the output they could produce. But when we're talking about labor market slack, it really matters if that person is looking for work, because from the point of view of how easy is it for an employer to hire, how easy is it for them to fill an open position, only the people who are actually looking for work are helping. They're only a subset of the people who aren't working matter, namely the subset that actually might be interested in taking that job. So labor market slack, in other words, we think there's a sort of bargaining power at all times in the labor market. There's a bargaining power between workers and employers, and that bargaining power is strongly influenced by how many people at this moment are out there actively looking for jobs. And that's sort of, we think, a central reason why unemployment rather than employment is the variable that we're often most interested in, because it's unemployment that is linked most directly to wages and inflation. A rise in employment doesn't necessarily have any particular consequences for what we think are going to happen to income distribution or inflation. A rise in unemployment, as we'll see, tends to make us think we're going to see lower wage growth, redistribution away from workers, and probably, at least traditionally, we thought lower inflation. So, okay, so how do we measure this stuff? Basically, what's going on with my, there we go. Okay, so basically, it's an exercise of sort of putting people in boxes. We start with the whole population, 330 million people living in the United States, give or take. Now, then we take a subset of this, the 16 years or older civilian non-institutionalized population. So we exclude, the 65 million or so children under the age of 16, big chunk of people. We exclude the 1.5 million people in the active duty military, the 2.5 million people or so who are incarcerated, and residents of nursing homes and similar facilities, which is another 1.5 million. So we basically, after we've taken out that, that 70 million, we've got left 60 million people, 260 million people. That 260, all of the BLS statistics that we're going to talk about, everything the BLS does is about this 260 million 260 million, civilian non-institutionalized population. The BLS does not even, they don't collect any information on the people that we've just excluded here. All right, so then we've got this 16 plus civilian non-institutionalized population, and out of that, we're separating out the labor force. And then within the labor force, we're going to have the employed and the unemployed. So you can imagine it's sort of like boxes. You've got, the biggest box is the whole population. And then within that, we've got a smaller box. This is the, civilian 16 plus non-institutionalized population. And then this box, in turn, we're going to subdivide into three boxes. So we've got not in the labor force. We've got employed. We've got unemployed. And these three boxes exactly fill up, this box. So everybody in this civilian 16 plus non-institutionalist population, everybody in that group ends up in exactly one of these three subcategories. They're either not in the labor force, or they're employed, or they're unemployed. Those are exclusive categories. And then right out here, we've got prisoners, soldiers, and most importantly, children. So how do we do this? You go in the employed box if in the last week you did any work for pay or profit, any, or you did at least 15 hours of unpaid work in a family farm or family-owned business, or you had a job, but you were not at work. You had a job, but you were not at work. And maybe you had a job, you were not at work because you were on vacation, you were sick, you had childcare issues, you were taking care of family, you were on maternity or paternity leave, you were on strike. Doesn't happen very much anymore when these categories were being devised. It was quite important. Or you're locked out by the employer, or you've been prevented from working by bad weather. Now, all of these categories of people are still counted as employed. And this actually was kind of an issue, has been kind of an issue during the pandemic period, because this category of has a job but not at work went up quite a lot during the last spring and summer. And so a lot of people argued that was really giving a misleading picture of the state of the labor market, because these people probably should have been called unemployed. But in any case, this is one of the fuzzy areas, because these people who don't literally fit the definition, in the sense that they did not do any work in the last week, and they may, in many of these cases, not have collected a paycheck either, are nonetheless still called employed. So just this is we can see here the normal number of people in this category at any given moment in recent years has been about 5 million, give or take 5 million or a little more. This past year, this is from March, it went up to 6.5 million. So an extra 1.5 million. And if you look over here, you see that although the number of people who were on vacation was not particularly high, and these other categories are mostly small, but the number of people who said they have a job, they're not at work for some other reason, was much higher than historically. So the question is whether those people should now, maybe going forward, this is not going to be an issue, but it's something to be aware of in terms of the interpretation of some of these numbers. Okay, so that's employed. If you're unemployed, first of all, you are not employed. That's the first test. If you are employed by the criteria there, you cannot be unemployed. But it's not enough not to be employed. You also have to want a job and have actively looked for work in the past 4 weeks. That's important. actively looked for work, meaning you contacted an employer in some fashion, basically. Submitted a resume, went to a job fair, called somebody, went to an employment agency or something. You made some active effort that could have resulted in you getting a job. That's pretty much the criteria. And then you have to be currently available for work. You have to be ready to start now if you were offered a job now. And all this stuff, I should say, is survey-based. They ask a very detailed set of questions, but the way you establish whether these things are true of somebody is by asking them. So now, common confusions about unemployment. It does not depend on whether you had a job in the past or why or when you left it. It does not have anything to do with whether you're eligible for unemployment insurance. It doesn't depend on your immigration status. All of this stuff, despite efforts by our last president to change it, all of our data collection does not ignores people's immigration status, doesn't ask about it, doesn't try to group people that way. And it doesn't matter if you're a student. It also doesn't matter, the last bullet got lost here, but it doesn't matter what your age is. As long as you're 16 or older, there's no separate category for retired people. If you are 90 years old, they're still, and you're not living in group quarters. If you're living in your own home, they're still going to ask you, do you want a job? Are you available for work? Have you looked for a job? And if you say yes to those questions, then you're unemployed. Okay, now not in the labor force then is everybody else in that 16 plus non-institutionalized civilian population box. You're not employed, you don't fit the criteria for unemployed, then you're not in the labor force. But there's a couple of subcategories here. What we call marginally attached workers are the ones who say they want a job and they're available for a job, but they have not looked for a job in the past 4 weeks. And then a subset of that group are what are called discouraged workers who did not look for a job in the last 4 weeks because they did not think there were any available. But the headline unemployment number does, it doesn't, you're not unemployed unless you actively look for a job in the past 4 weeks. Now then, there's some weird and ambiguous cases here. First of all, people who are on a layoff, this is, not a big feature of American employment today, but was much more so, again, decades ago when these categories were being developed, where you had manufacturers, typically unionized manufacturers with highly fluctuating demands for their products. And so they agreed to a system where if they needed fewer workers at a given moment, they would obviously get rid of some of their workers, but they would commit when they started hiring again to hire back those people either in the order of seniority. Well, typically you'd be laid off in the order of seniority, least senior first, and then you'd be hired back, most senior first. But so the people who had lost a job in typically a manufacturer would have a sort of a commitment, a contractual commitment by that manufacturer to hire them back before hiring any new people. So that was the situation on layoff. Again, not really a feature, I don't think, of employment today, but as far as the BLS is concerned, it's still a category. And it means basically, if you're on layoff, you do not have to be actively searching for a job to be counted as unemployed. You just have to be willing to go back if your employer calls you back. Again, mostly of historical interest now. Unpaid work, key point here, unpaid work counts as employment only if it is done in a family business or farm, not internships or anything else. Prison labor isn't counted. A lot of people in prisons do actually perform work, a quite high proportion, not for private businesses. That's something people pay a lot of attention to. It's a very, very small part of the prison employment picture. People work at jobs maintaining the prisons. That's and also doing work for the public sector within prisons. There's a lot of that kind of employment, but it doesn't matter because prisoners are not counted in the statistics. We've got that employed but not at work category I mentioned. Involuntary part-time, again, if you have even 1 hour of paid work during the week, you're employed. But in some cases, functionally, somebody doing very little work who would like to be doing more is practically unemployed. And then multiple jobs. Fewer of these than you might think. Actually, it's not that big a number of people who are working multiple jobs in this country. But if you are, it doesn't matter. The question is just, do you have a job? Okay, so those are some sort of ambiguous cases. Another data issue here is the question of seasonal adjustment. Unemployment has a pretty regular seasonal pattern. It rises in the summer because there's a lot of education-related work that goes away during the summer break, and it rises in the winter because there's a lot of work that has to be done outdoors, particularly construction work that goes away in the winter. So unemployment rates are typically higher in the summer and winter, lower in the spring and fall. So we have a process of seasonal adjustment that's supposed to strip out those regular movements so you can see if there's anything actually new happening. You can do those either additive. You can say in recent years, X thousand additional people were unemployed, in December relative to November, or you can say it's multiplicative. Unemployment rose by a certain percentage, from December to January in each of the recent years. It's a standard thing to do, but it can create some issues if the sort of, especially with the multiplicative approach, because if you have really high unemployment for some reason in one month, then that's going to lead to a very large seasonal adjustment factor for the next month, which may or may not be appropriate. So anyway, to see what this looks like in practice, we've got the red here is the not seasonally adjusted, the raw number, and the blue is the seasonally adjusted number. Now they actually, I should say, these are the current ones. They changed the process early in the pandemic. The seasonal adjustment thing was giving really weird results because of this multiplicative thing. So if you look at the numbers that were being published for unemployment back in June or July or August even, they didn't actually look, the seasonally adjusted ones didn't look like this. And in particular, it looked like there was a much bigger fall in unemployment than there really was. So, but they fixed that. So these are the new revised ones where it isn't so dramatic. But what you do see here is, you can see, in the winter, in the summer here, here's the summer. You can see that not seasonally adjusted one goes up, and then here in the winter, the not seasonally adjusted one goes up, and then here we are in the summer again, and here we are in the winter again. You see each of these every 6 months, these spikes. These are these seasonal spikes. So the blue line is the seasonal adjustment that's supposed to strip those out. But it can create issues sometimes if you report the seasonally adjusted number as if it were just the number. I mean, for instance, if we look here on the extreme right, during January, the unemployment rate actually went up. The unemployment rate went up, but because we say, well, it went up by less than we would expect it to, given the fact that unemployment always rises in January, the seasonally adjusted one goes down. But again, given the weird situation we're in right now, we might wonder if our normal seasonal adjustment process is really giving us accurate figures. And maybe the thing we actually believe is the red line, the raw number, the not seasonally adjusted number, which went up. So again, something always to be conscious of when you're working with any kind of macroeconomic data is whether it's seasonally adjusted. And if it is seasonally adjusted, whether there's any reason to think that might be inappropriate in the particular situation that you're worried about. So, okay, so typically we talk about, we look at a couple of different ratios when we talk about unemployment. The one we talk about the most is, the unemployment rate. This is the thing we're all very familiar with. The thing that's most often reported was in that last figure I just showed you, which is just the number of unemployed people, divided by the labor force. In other words, the unemployed people divided by the unemployed plus the employed people. Now, one thing to notice about this is this thing can go up if unemployment goes up. That's usually how we interpret it. We interpret a rise or fall in the unemployment rate as a rise and fall in the number of people who are unemployed. But obviously, the denominator here matters too. And if the size of the labor force changes, that's going to show up as a change in the measured unemployment rate. So in particular, if people leave the labor force, if people stop looking for work, the measured unemployment rate is going to fall, even though there wasn't any increase in employment. Or conversely, if you have a big fall in employment, let's say that results from whatever happens, then the unemployment rate could go up without a change in the number of unemployed people. That second case is not probably very relevant. We talk about the labor force participation rate, which is just the number of people in the labor force divided by the civilian non-institutional population, which is, people tend to think, historically, people tend to think, and this is an important thing in understanding how these categories play out in debates, people tend to think the unemployment rate is something that adjusts quickly in response to demand conditions. People have made a decision that they want to work. Whether or not they actually find a job depends on how many businesses are hiring. People tend to think, on the other hand, that the labor force is more stable. People tend to think that the decision on whether or not you would like to be working depends on your age, your personal situation, whether you have kids, whether you have other sources of income, things that don't really depend on the current state of the economy very much. And so the traditional view is that strong demand can bring down the unemployment rate, but the labor force is a supply side phenomenon that's just doing what it's doing because of these long-term things that don't really have much to do with the current state of the economy. This is one of these ideas that's really come under a lot of criticism under the past decade because it's seemed increasingly clear that people's decision about whether or not to seek work, people's decision about whether or not to enter the labor force actually strongly depends on the conditions in the labor market. And so if we and so the labor force itself also changes in response to demand conditions. There's actually, the labor force is not a supply side phenomenon in the way that people used to think. And if you really believe that, then the whole notion of the labor force becomes a little irrelevant, and the conventional definition of unemployment also becomes maybe a little irrelevant. And if that's really what you believe, you might prefer to focus on this third ratio, which is the employment population ratio. It's the ratio of people who are working relative to our big box of people who. So in other words, in terms of these boxes, if we think that this line is very fuzzy, if we're not really confident about this line, or if we think, I should have put these in a different order, or if we think, this line, actually, that's what I meant. If we think these two categories are really hard to distinguish, are kind of the line between them is really fuzzy, and it's not clear who really belongs in this box versus this box, then we might want to not make our ideas about the economy really depend on the distinction between these two boxes and just compare the size of the employed box to this size box. Now, the civilian 16 plus non-institutionalized population is not purely a fixed supply side phenomenon because immigration does certainly respond to demand conditions. But this box has a better claim to being relatively fixed and stable over some, business cycle than this box does, because again, if we think that the transitions in and out of the labor force really depend on business cycle conditions, then it's not really useful to distinguish not in the labor force from unemployed. Functionally, maybe they're the same category. So anyway, this is a big debate that has been going on over the past few years, past decade. But the language we talk about this stuff still does tend to have a important distinction between not in the labor force and unemployed. So there are alternative measures of unemployment if we don't trust the official measure. Now, one, as I just said, would be to throw out the category of unemployment and simply focus on the employment population ratio, EPOP, the employment population ratio. Other things that people sometimes do is take some other categories of people and move them in or possibly out of the unemployed box. So those discouraged or marginally attached workers, we might think are the ones out of the labor force who are most likely to re-enter the labor force if demand conditions were better. So maybe we should call them unemployed. Part-time for economic reasons. If somebody says they're working fewer than 35 hours a week, the BLS asks them, would you like to work more hours? Is there, have you tried to get more hours at one of your current employers? Have you looked for work at another employer? And if they say they have actively tried to do one of those things, then they're put in this category part-time for economic reasons, and arguably should be considered unemployed, since they're really in the same situation as the people we call unemployed. They're willing to work, able to work, available for work, looking for work, but not able to work, at least, for some of the hours that they have available. On the other side, some people say that we should really be focusing only on the short-term unemployed, because if we're interested in labor market slack, if we're interested in how available workers are for the jobs that are out there, the long-term unemployed aren't really available because businesses really don't like to hire people who've been unemployed for a long time. People, it's a demoralizing process to be unemployed and looking for jobs month after month after month. It reduces perhaps your ability to work. Your skills get rusty or whatever. You have personal problems. Anyway, this is an argument made, typically on the more conservative side, that the sort of economically relevant unemployment rate might be lower than the official one because these long-term unemployed people are not really in, or maybe it's just that they've been unemployed for a year because there really is some obstacle to them working. So we shouldn't call them unemployed because they're not, even if they say they're available for work, they aren't really. So that's an argument that, these ones, are arguments that the conventional unemployment rate understates the true level of unemployment. This is an argument that it overstates it. And then we've also got this other category Joan Robinson introduced as disguised unemployment, which is basically people who formally meet the criteria of being employed, but are doing something much less productive than they are capable of doing because, again, of a lack of demand, a lack of jobs in the economy. So a lot of this is going to look like self-employment. Her example is somebody who goes and sells something on the street, or in a poor country, maybe gathers firewood in a forest to sell. The point is, you do something to get an income. The example of this, John Ewell, a post-Keynesian economist, who's one of the few people who've tried to study this empirically, he says, if you look at the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, which one consistently has the lowest unemployment rate? The answer is Mexico. Why does Mexico have a very low unemployment rate? Is it because they've got consistently a booming labor market where everybody who wants to work has a good job? No, it's because they really don't have any substantial system of unemployment benefits and a relatively quite limited social safety net. So people who don't have regular wage income have to find something. And so there's a lot of informal employment. And the same could be, South Africa or other countries that is really a form of unemployment. This is, and in the US, we don't have, the sort of informal sector, street hawkers, but we certainly have people who are doing less productive work than they're capable of. I think a great many of us. This is hard to measure, but possibly quite important. So those categories, the discouraged and marginally attached. So you take the the marginally attached people, the people who say they would like to work and are available for work but are not looking for work. So you take them, and then you add your part-time for economic reasons, add those to the unemployment, and you get what is called U6. U6, this blue line here, which is sort of the broadest measure of unemployment published by the BLS. Now, a lot of people like to say, well, the U6 is a better measure of the true unemployment rate, and it shows unemployment is a much bigger problem than we thought. I don't know if that's right. I'm not sure that the people they call marginally attached are necessarily more likely to actually take up work than other people who aren't in the labor force. I think there is a lot of fuzziness there in terms, but it's not clear that we're really getting a good measure of it in this way. But more importantly, what you see here is these things really move together. U6 is the official one, by the way, is U3. So U6 and U3 really move together. U6 is pretty consistently a bit less than double U3. So if we're interested in a sort of what we're usually interested in policy, which is what's going on in the labor market relative to the past. Is it getting stronger? Is it getting weaker? Is it stronger or weaker than it was 10 or 20 years ago? If we're, for instance, if we wanted to compare, the labor market right before the pandemic to the labor, the late 90s generally considered, the strongest labor market in our lifetimes, really. And the last time, incidentally, where you really had broad-based wage increases across the income distribution. So if we say, well, how close before the pandemic were we getting to the late 90s? You can see if we use the standard U3, we'd say we're about at level. And if we use U6, we'd say we're about at level. So it's not changing the answer to that sort of question very much. But nonetheless, it's a statistic that people like to point to who are skeptical of the official unemployment rate. So another important variable here is hours. We talk about employment, people providing labor. It's a labor market. People are selling labor, our time, our energy, our social existence to a boss who can use it for some purpose. But how much labor we're selling is not just about whether we are employed, but how many hours per week we're employed. And so, potentially you could think that in addition to the number of people who have jobs or don't have jobs, an important source of variation in sort of employment would be hours worked. And historically that was true, especially if you look back at the Great Depression. Oops, this is a little typo here. If you go back to the Great Depression, uh, there was a big fall in working hours uh, in the early Depression. Manufacturing work week. A lot of these statistics we really only have for manufacturing. That was the part of the economy that was systematic efforts to measure were made earlier. So if you go back to the Great Depression, the typical work week in manufacturing fell from 44 hours a week in 1929 to less than 35 hours in 1934. So by about a quarter in 5 years. It's a huge fall. And so in a sense, you could say the huge increase in unemployment that we see in the statistics from the early 30s actually understates the level of labor market slack, the labor of underutilization of labor during that period because of this, you know, huge cut in the typical hours being worked. That is not a phenomenon that we've seen in post-war recessions. Here you see average weekly hours per production and non-supervisory employees. It's basically, you know, the 85% or so of people who basically work hourly. You know, you can see there's a little bit of a drop in recessions, and of course there's a long-term drop. You know, at least going back to the 70s, and actually I could extend this figure back further, and it's a long-term drop going back longer than that. But the fall in recessions, although it's there, is pretty modest in most of these recessions. That looks like a big drop, but it's you know, less than an hour. Compared with, you know, the 10 hours a week that happened during the Depression. So it's not huge falls. You know, this is sort of striking, but again, it's not a huge number. Then, of course, we have this at the end, as with many statistics, many employment-related statistics, everything. People are going to be spending many years to come trying to deal with the statistical issues posed by the pandemic. But as with many labor market indicators, there's a huge compositional effect because some people, let's say in food service and entertainment, were much more likely to lose their jobs than people in other sectors. And the people who lost their jobs did not look like the people who didn't lose them. Among other things, the sectors that saw the biggest job loss also tended to have somewhat shorter working weeks. A lot of people work part-time in food service. So this thing here is a little problematic in terms of, you can't really interpret it as a sort of, it doesn't represent a systematic shift towards longer working weeks. Anyway, but so in a lot of macroeconomic contexts, we don't have to worry about hours very much if we're talking about the contemporary United States. But if we're looking historically, or perhaps in other countries, this would also be an important, if we're interested in sort of what happens to employment in response to shifts in demand or other factors, we would want to potentially think about hours as well as the number of people working. So all of this data that we're talking about here is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics within the Department of Labor. Now, most economic statistics in the United States come from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the Commerce Department, but the labor-related stuff comes from the BLS. The ultimate source is the current population survey administered by census. Well, for the household level stuff, all this stuff, some of it comes from surveys of households asking them, you know, do you have a job? Did you look for a job? That stuff comes from the current population survey administered by the census. There's also an employer survey administered by the BLS itself. And all the data from this stuff is published once a month. Typically, the data for each month is published in the first week of the following month in the employment situation publication, which is sort of the thing to pay attention to if you're interested in employment-related statistics. And then they're revised, sometimes substantially, in subsequent months. So if you pick up the employment situation, you know, the first two figures you're going to see are one showing employment and one showing unemployment over the past couple of years. So again, as with any kind of economic statistic, these are much more dramatic right now than they would have been a year or two ago. But in this case, we can see the unemployment rate under the sort of coronavirus jumped from under 4%, where it had been basically throughout 2019, up to over 14%, and then it's come down, but it has certainly not returned to its old level and seems in recent months to be sort of leveling out. Employment, meanwhile, which was growing steadily, collapsed by, from over 150 million people working down to 130 million people. And then it came back up, but only about halfway. So you can see if you compare, immediate pre-COVID to today, there's about 10 million people fewer working. And so that, one thing, if you do the math, you'll see is that the fall in employment is larger than the rise in unemployment, which we can interpret in various ways, but it's an important fact about the employment situation right now. Now, then they'll break this down into the sort of categories that we were just talking about. So we have our biggest box, the civilian non-institutional population. Again, as I said, there's another 70 million people in the United States the BLS doesn't ever look at or talk about at all. Mostly children, but also people in the military, people in prisons, and people in other types of institutions. So their biggest box that they look at is the civilian non-institutional population, which goes up pretty steadily year after year. It actually went down a little bit. I don't know why between December and January. I really don't know. We may be experiencing some negative net immigration. I'm not sure. The civilian labor force, as you can see, this is the way they do it. They typically give you 1 year ago and then the 2 preceding months. Well, you compare the labor force today to a year ago, it's 4.5 million smaller. So in other words, that's why the fall in employment is larger than the rise in unemployment, because 4.5 million people fewer have jobs that are not actively looking for jobs. So employment, is close to 10 million smaller than it was, but unemployment here is less than 5 million greater. So of the 10 million fewer people who are not working, about half of them describe themselves as unemployed, and about half of them do not, and are therefore considered to have left the labor force. So you can see here, the not in labor force category is up by about 5 million. And then they give you some of these they give you these ratios we talked about. The labor force participation rate down by 2 points, the employment population rate down by about 4 points, and the unemployment rate up by about 2 points. And it's not a coincidence, obviously, that those numbers add up. Generally speaking, the change in the employment population ratio is going to be equal to the change in the labor force participation rate minus the change in the unemployment rate. So if we then, this is another reason, another interesting thing they ask about, among the people who are unemployed, they ask them basically, why are you unemployed? So one possible reason you're unemployed is that you had a job and you lost it. So you can see a year ago, pre-COVID, that was the biggest category. 2.5 million people were unemployed. It still is the biggest category today, 7 of the 10 or so million people employed. There are re-entrants, people who previously had a job, then were not in the labor force for some period of time, and then decided to seek a job again. So that category is about the same today as it was a year ago. It's the second biggest category. Job leavers, people who voluntarily left their past job, that number is smaller today than it was, and that's important as we'll come back to it. And then new entrants, which means people, typically young people, 17-year-olds, but also, new immigrants, or, people who's, for whatever reason have not previously been in the labor market. Again, pretty stable group there. Duration of unemployment. This is something people pay a lot of attention to. These slides are weirdly lagging here. I'm not quite sure why it's doing this. Well, hopefully the duration of unemployment will show up here in a sec. There we go, duration of unemployment. So people pay a lot of attention to this, again, because there's a widespread belief that long-term unemployment is more serious, more socially costly, a bigger problem than short-term unemployment. And also, at least among a lot of economists, long-term unemployment is more likely to be structural. It's more likely to represent some sort of mismatch between the worker and the jobs available. That if people basically just can't find a job, if they keep looking, they will find a job. So if they can't find a job and continue to be unable to find a job, there's something wrong with them. widespread view among economists, or something wrong, we could say, with the jobs that are being offered, that they don't fit this person. But may or may not be the case. In any case, what we can see here is that the rise in unemployment over the past year is really concentrated at that long-term unemployment part. That the number of people who've recently lost their jobs and are still looking for work is not much higher than it was a year ago, and actually lower than it was, a couple of months ago. The people who've been who lost, who on the other hand, this group of people who've had been out of work for 6 months or more and are still looking for a job has gotten a lot bigger. So that's, again, that's something. If the notion is in a well-functioning labor market, there will be people who are looking for work. That's okay, but there should be sort of steady turnover. If people are stuck in that situation for extended periods, that's a more serious concern. So this is something people pay a lot of attention to. Then we've got our part-time category. As you can see, most people who work part-time report that they are choosing to work part-time, that they do not want or are not seeking additional hours. That's this non-economic reasons here, and that's still as true as it was before. Then this slack work or business conditions are people who basically would like more hours at their current employment, and can't get it. And then this category is people who are looking for other jobs and can't find them. So again, probably a lot in this category of food service workers, and other specific sectors that have been hit by COVID. But in any case, again, something if we want a broader view of what is labor market slack, this is something we would pay attention to. Not in the labor force. This is one reason that, again, I'm skeptical that this piece of U6 is really telling us that much, because these are just pretty small numbers in the scale. Okay, 2 million people is not a small number of people. Although, again, in the scale of 10 million unemployed, it's not going to really transform our picture. And then, this group who fit this definition of discouraged workers, people who say they are not looking for work because they don't think there is any work, is really quite small. And incidentally, discouraged workers are a subset of marginally attached. Marginally attached is everybody who says, I would like a job, I'm available, but I'm not looking. Then you're marginally attached. If you fit the criteria of wanting a job and being available for a job, but you have not looked for one in the past 4 weeks. And then the discouraged is the subset of those people where, when they ask them, why haven't you looked for a job in the past 4 weeks, they say, because there aren't any jobs out there. It's not a huge group of people. Okay, so that's if we're looking at sort of a static picture of the situation around employment. These are the sort of the major things that we will look at, the major pieces of that larger set of aggregates, the unemployment and employment. If we're looking at a static picture, but of course, we're also very interested in transitions between statuses. People change employment situations a lot. On average in the United States, about 4% of people leave their jobs every month. 4% may not sound like a big number, but that's every month. So if you extrapolate that over a year or two, there's a lot of people coming and going from employment situations. And so these transitions are potentially quite informative as well for what's going on out there. Sorry, it's hard to scrupulously avoid the word, so I'm just going to say what's going on out there in the labor market. And there's a separate publication from the BLS that focuses on this, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, which people talk about quite a bit, who are interested in sort of tracking what's going on with employment. So if we look at this, what we see here is that on average, about the new hires constitute about 4% of the workforce each month. That's, this top line here. It's fairly stable, except, again, this is going to be a data problem for the rest of our lives. Everything goes haywire in 2020. But quits and other separations includes layoffs, people being fired, businesses closing, basically any situation in which somebody involuntarily loses their job. That's other separations, and quits are voluntarily leaving their jobs. So these things, there is a clear cyclical pattern here. So you can see in recessions, it's less clear actually in the dot-com bust, but very clear in the more recent one. new hires go down a lot. Um, Quits also go down in recessions because it's a much more, risky thing to leave your job in a weak labor market than a strong one. And not surprisingly, other separations go up in a recession because businesses lay off people and businesses fail, and then everybody loses their job. So there's a strong, and then you can see, during the course of an expansion, typically, the actual sort of dynamics of business cycles in the US and most advanced other countries is not, you have a recession, then you have a recovery, and then you're back to normal. People sort of imagine a movement like this. Or, economists imagine a movement like this, where there's just lots of sort of squiggles around a trend. But it doesn't look like either of those. The actual pattern, looks like this. Deep recession, slow growth, deep recession, slow growth. It's more like a wave. So we can see that clearly here, that the pace of hiring fell steeply during the recession and then rose steadily over the next decade up to, the pandemic. And similarly, the other separations line rose in the recession and then declined steadily, it's not quite as easy to see here, but fairly steadily until the pandemic. Now, the interesting thing here is the behavior of the quits line, because you'll notice it falls steeply in the recession and then it rises during the expansion. And this is actually quite important. This quits category, voluntarily leaving people leaving their jobs, is actually an important indicator of the relative strength, let's say, of labor and employers, the relative bargaining position of people selling their labor and people buying that labor, because people don't voluntarily leave their jobs in general unless they are confident of their ability to get another job. So this line here is really telling you something about how confident workers are in their ability to get a decent new job somewhere else. And obviously that's not only going to influence their likelihood of quitting their current job, but it's going to influence things like how demanding they are in terms of salaries and working conditions, how much risk they might be willing to take to join a union, how hard they're going to work if the job is, onerous and difficult. So this thing is an important indicator of kind of the overall. So you can see, again, there's a strong cyclical pattern here where quits and hires both rise, in the expansion and fall in the recession, and other separations move in the other direction. And in general, the height of this green line is going to be just a little bit over double the sum of the other lines, because in general, the labor force, the employment is growing a bit every month. So in general, we would expect the green line to be just a bit over double the sum of the other two. Then, of course, we can see in the pandemic, other separations went through the roof. It looks like, in 1 month, 8% of people lost their jobs, which is not, there's no historical precedent for that whatsoever. I mean, it was, well, we all lived through it. It was crazy. So there was a huge spike in other separations, a substantial, although not as dramatic, fall in hires. The fall in hires, was almost immediately reversed. This is actually sort of an interesting phenomenon here, that businesses' hiring choices, they dropped off just temporarily, and then basically all those missed hires were immediately made up. So there doesn't seem to be much of a sort of sustained effect there. The separations, the case is not as clear cut, but certainly they came back down after the pandemic spike. And then you can see very few people were quitting their jobs in the worst part of the pandemic, but that number has been coming back up as well. So, if you look at this stuff, the data through, I think this one may only go through December. Some of this stuff is out, the basic employment situation is out for January this year. I think this one stops in December of last year. But as of December of last year, you would not necessarily look at this and think that there's a sustained weakening of the labor market. In other words, the willingness of employers to hire is sort of on trend with where it was, and the willingness of workers to quit, which again is an indicator of how good people feel about their employment prospects, also seems to be kind of, it's still, again, you can look back here and it's very clear there was an extended period after the official end of the recession when people were very aware of quitting their jobs. And also, where we're hiring, if you look back here, hiring in the 2000s, around 4% of each month, around 4% of the existing workforce new hires. And you can see it wasn't until 2016 that we got somewhere close to that and never really reached it. So there was an extended period here of a really weak labor market. We say a weak labor market, we mean one which has a lot of slack, one which has a lot of excess of people looking for work. And then, right before the pandemic, it seemed like we were getting back at least to the last decade. If I could extend this back further to the 90s, you'd see hires even higher and quits even higher. But it seems at this point, like maybe at least so far, the post-pandemic is going to continue the pre-pandemic trends, or at least that it could. Now, that's talking about people leaving their jobs or getting hired. If we think about it in terms of how people are moving between these different statuses, again, there's a lot of movement. So this is from the Blanchard textbook. It's millions of people per month. And one of the interesting, so you can see, on average each month, 3 million people leave one job and take a different job. Out of the 8 million, this is a typical, this is not the most recent month, it's a typical month during the 90s and 2000s. If there's 8 or 9 people unemployed, about a quarter of them find employment, but about the same number of people move the other way, back to unemployment. And then, people who are not in the labor force, some of them move to unemployed. That means essentially somebody starts looking for a job, but does not immediately find one. And then another 2 million people who were looking for a job give up and go this way. Now, an interesting thing here that I wanted to highlight is these arrows. You can see that of the people entering employment, almost twice as many of them are coming straight from out of the labor force as are coming from the ranks of the unemployed. And again, of the people who leave employment, almost twice as many leave the labor force as go into the ranks of the unemployed. And that, I think, should really make us wonder if unemployment is actually as useful an analytic tool as we tend to use it as. If most of the flows in and out of employment are happening with people who aren't in the labor force, then this thing is not a very good gauge. Again, I said, why do we care about unemployment? If we're economists, we care about it as a measure of labor market slack. How many workers are available for employers? How easy it is for employers to fill a job. But if most of the workers who are coming into employment are coming out of labor force, then this is not necessarily that pool. Now we might think, well, yeah, there's lots of people over here. There's a subset of the people over here who are available for work, but the size of this ball and the size of this ball are going to grow and shrink together. So it doesn't make much difference. And the fact that U6 and U3 move together, as we saw, would make us a little more confident of that. But at the same time, the fact that a lot of the movement in and out of employment is not going to the unemployed, but to the people counted out of the labor force. I mean, in a sense, if you are moving into employment, you are part of the labor force. So this is a little bit of should make us a little bit concerned about leaning too hard on unemployment. On the other hand, and this is always the case in macroeconomics, we have an established set of procedures to measure unemployment, and we've been doing it for a long time. So we can use that number with a sort of at least a clear understanding of what that number means. Whether it tells us everything we wish it would tell us about the economy, at least we know what the number itself means, and we can compare it reasonably consistently with other numbers in the past. Whereas if we create some new indicator, we don't have an older series to compare it to. So as always, there's trade-offs. We never get to measure the thing that we really are interested in, and there's always a trade-off between what we can reasonably and reliably measure versus how close it is to the concept that we really would like to be measuring. But in any case, again, the point here also is there's a lot of churn. Again, these are monthly numbers. So this is a lot of people transitioning between these different statuses. Now, the job opening and quit rate, as I was talking about before, are also very important indicators of labor market slack. So that brings us really to the last thing I'm going to talk about in this lecture, which is that if we're interested, again, if the big question is basically this balance of bargaining power between employers and workers, and you don't have to be a radical for thinking that that's very important. In fact, the mainstream also thinks that it's very important. Then the unemployment rate is one thing you can look at. But job openings and quit rates are also important because if labor is scarce, if it's hard for businesses to find workers, and if therefore workers are going to have more bargaining power, then we'll also see that workers are more willing to quit the current jobs, as I discussed, and that employers will have more unfilled job openings. So the BLS, in their establishment survey, where they're surveying businesses rather than households, they ask, how many openings do you currently have that you don't have somebody for? How many workers are you currently, how many positions are you currently trying to find people for? So that's job openings. I think they also, as a supplement to that, look at posted job openings in various places. But it's the employer survey. You ask them directly, how many openings do you have? And then we can have a vacancy rate. We can take the total. Basically, we have a vacancy rate, and I should have put this on the slide, but I'll just write it here quickly. Basically, we have so we vacancy rate is unfilled jobs divided by unfilled jobs plus employment. We have to do it that we have to add the unfilled jobs and the employment, because it's basically of the potential jobs, the jobs that employers would like to be employing people for, how many of them actually have people filling them. So this is the vacancy rate. We take the unfilled jobs and divide it by the sum of the unfilled jobs and employment. And that's another measure of it's sort of the flip side of the unemployment rate. It's the reverse of the unemployment rate. Instead of asking how many workers are unable to find jobs, we ask how many jobs are unable to find workers. It doesn't get reported as much, but conceptually it's sort of measuring the same thing from the other direction. So this is formalized then, the relationship between these things is formalized in what's called the Beveridge curve. British economist, post-war economist, William Beveridge, I think was his first name. Anyway, important guy in the development of the British welfare state associated with the Labour Party. But anyway, he thought a good way of kind of assessing the conditions for employment is to compare the vacancy rate to the number of unfilled jobs. Basically, if demand, and this is important for us because if demand is driving employment outcomes, then we'll expect these things to move opposite from each other. When unemployment is high and there are very few job openings, that suggests we've got a situation of demand deficiency unemployment. If there's a lot of people looking for work and very few employers wanting to hire, that's a sign that there's just not enough money being spent, not enough being sold to employ everybody's labor. On the other hand, if unemployment is high, but job openings are also high, if a lot of workers are looking for work, but at the same time, a lot of employers are looking for workers, that suggests a structural story where there's some kind of mismatch. There's something that's stopping the available workers from connecting with the available jobs. So we can plot these things in what's called the Beveridge curve. And this here is an example of the Beveridge curve for the United States. So we've got on the horizontal axis, we've got the unemployment rate. And on the vertical axis, we've got the vacancy rate calculated, as I just said. And we can then see that most of the time we get a very nice curve here. So back in 2000, a fairly strong labor market, the unemployment rate was around 4% and the vacancy rate was around 3.5. And incidentally, Beveridge's own idea with this is that you always, for full employment, you always want the vacancy rate to be at least as high as the unemployment rate. That was sort of he thought of that as sort of an operational definition of full employment. Keep the unemployment rate below the vacancy rate. There should always be more jobs looking for workers than there are workers looking for jobs. People don't, that piece of the idea has not really remained current, but the comparison. So in 2000, we had about 4% unemployment, 3.5% vacancy rate. Then, that's the end of the sort of dot-com boom. So by 2002, the unemployment rate is up at 6% and the vacancy rate has fallen below 2.5%. But then we get a recovery. So by 2004, unemployment's down to 5% and vacancy rate's about 3%. And by 2006, unemployment is heading back towards 4%. So by 2006, we're almost back at where we were in 2000. And the thing about this that's nice and makes it clear that this is like a real relationship is that we're moving up and down on this same diagonal line. Then you can see 2006, we're almost back at 2000, but then 2008, we've had the mortgage, the housing bubble burst and, the financial crisis. So we've moved back down here, but again, back on that same line. Now, the interesting thing is that from 2008 to 2010, there was a big increase in unemployment, but no increase in the vacancy rate. And this is where a lot of those stories about structural unemployment and video games and, zero marginal product workers came in, because at this point, it seemed like the normal indication of a shortage of demand it was not what we were seeing. Instead, we saw unemployment rising without any rise in vacancies, suggesting that the problem was not businesses not wanting more workers, but workers being unable to work for some other reason. But then, as you can see, after that, as we got the recovery, we moved right back up this diagonal. So again, and the fact that we do see these movements is really strong proof, well, at least strong evidence, let's say, that the dominant factor in changes in unemployment in modern capitalist societies is demand. If the main factors were things like technology, whether robots were replacing people's jobs, or you know, it was some story about labor market institutions and how whether unions were demanding too much, if we had those sorts of stories, we would see a movement this way. When you saw, you know, or if it was a skills, you know, an issue with skills or whatever, we would see, you know, we would see movements that in the other direction. The fact that whenever unemployment falls, we see businesses looking for more workers suggests that the problem, because it suggests that the problem is a lack of demand. Anyway, the relationship generally holds. Now, the interesting thing, of course, again, the pandemic has been interesting for all kinds of things, is this, which is the past year. And what we see here, and this is, you know, in a sense, it's very confirming for our interpretation of this thing, is that we had a huge increase in unemployment with no fall in job openings. So, you know, in the last recession, the movement went this way. In fact, in both of the, you know, we've got two recessions in this thing here that are both going this way. In this pandemic period, it's a straight horizontal line. Unemployment spikes up, job vacancies don't drop at all. And so this is a much more structural story. And of course, it makes sense that we would have a structural story, because the problem, the fundamental reason people were not working over the past year, the fundamental reason was not a lack of money flowing through the economy, but an inability to safely do a lot of the work that we are used to doing. And so the fact that this past movement is so far off the Beveridge curve is actually, you know, a strong argument that the Beveridge curve is a useful tool for distinguishing between these different types of unemployment. And I'm going to end this lecture there, and the next lecture will pick up on a little more about the connections between employment outcomes and other macroeconomic aggregates.
What does that graph mean?
Hold on, let me just